This lecture is going to be talking about family-centered care and specifically health promotion in the young child or the preschooler, the school-age child, and the adolescents. Because of the way the chapters are set up, rather than talking about each individual aspect and covering all three age groups, we'll talk specifically about the preschooler first, and then we'll talk about the school-age child, and then we'll talk about the adolescents. So if it seems a little repetitive, I'm sorry, but I want to make sure we're covering everything that's in each chapter. So first, the preschooler. When we're looking at the preschool period, it lasts from ages 3 to 5 years of age. So if you think about it, 5-year-olds are usually the age that kids start going to kindergarten. And so this is that preschool age. It also, 3-year-olds usually aren't looked at as being preschoolers. Usually that's 4-year-olds as far as school systems are concerned. But the 3-year-old really starts acting differently than when they were at 2 years of age. The biggest lifestyle change for this age group is going from being a non-school age child to getting ready and going off to school. And they get really, really excited about the possibilities. And you'll often hear 3-year-olds starting to say, I want to go to school. And especially if they have an older sibling that's in school, school is a very fascinating thing to them. They're starting to experience not only these little brief separations from their parents and their family, but now these longer separations that last an entire day doesn't seem to get them quite as upset as what they did earlier. They're also starting to use language for mental symbolizations. So if they're feeling sad, they're starting to use language to describe their sadness and or other emotions that they may feel. They also have an increased attention span and their memory is longer as well, which is part of what makes them ready to look at educational opportunities. As far as biological development is concerned, their physical growth is starting to slow down a little bit and stabilize. Their average weight gain still remains about 5 pounds per year, and their average height increases by about 2.5 to 3 inches per year. So not quite as much as when they were tiny little kids. Their body systems are maturing and stabilizing, and they can adjust to moderate stress and change better than when they were younger. When we look at their gross motor skills, these skills are well established. They can walk and run. And remember, I talked about with the toddlers how they do more of a sideways kind of run that doesn't look at all like what we think about when we say that somebody is running. By the time they get to this age, if you ask them to run somewhere, they look like an older child or an adult when they run. They're also climbing things much more gracefully, which of course increases their risk of falls. But that's one of those things that we would expect as part of their development of their gross motor skills. One of the most fascinating things to watch is them jumping, because when a 2-year-old wants to jump, they bend their knees and they look like they ought to take off and jump, that their feet should come off the ground, but they don't. So by the time they get to be 3, they've learned the process of actually getting their feet to leave the ground and truly jump. When we're looking at fine motor skills, the fine motor skill development is reflective in eye-hand coordination and muscle coordination. So when they draw, their drawings are starting to become a little more specific, and they're starting to be able to dress themselves, button their buttons. zip their zippers, even starting to tie their shoes as we start looking at 4 and 5-year-olds. And they're able to get small objects to go into small holes of toys and really manipulate smaller objects. Looking at Erickson, as far as their psychosocial development is concerned, it's the development of the sense of initiative. Initiative in this case usually is referring to learning new things, going new places, and being able to um, do the things that you need to do in order to go to school. This is their chief psychosocial task for their age. Uh, the opposite side is guilt, anxiety, and fear that can result from thoughts that differ from whatever they feel the expected behavior is. So when we have a child that doesn't feel that they're as successful as their peers in learning something, they start feeling fearful that something's wrong with them. Uh, the development of the superego, when we start talking about Freud in this stage, is the development of conscience, of knowing what's right and wrong. The cognitive development that they're getting at, like I referred to earlier, means that they're starting to get ready for school. Not so much that they're really ready for scholastic learning, but they're wanting to learn those things. They want to learn their alphabet. They want to learn their numbers, how to add and subtract. But what we see with them is, for instance, they may be able to sing the alphabet song, but if you show them a letter, and if you show them the letters in a row that matches with the alphabet song, they're able to tell you which letter is which. But if you point to a letter outside of the alphabet song, they will actually hum the alphabet song to themselves to tell you what that letter is. It has a lot to do with the that problem has a lot to do with why Sesame Street just teaches random letters to kids and shows them this random letter because that helps them learn the letter better than hearing it in a specific order. We also look at the successful achievement of cognitive goals at this stage as far as the reasoning why the kids are ready to go to school at 5 or 6. There's some literature out there that supports sending kids to school at a later age, but I don't believe we'll ever see that in our country because our country values that early education. They see early education as being a way to be successful, although waiting until a child's brain is a little more mature actually helps them to learn things faster. When we look at their cognitive development, Piaget puts them in the pre-operational phase. This spans the ages of 2 to 7 years. So, as you can see, as a preschooler from 3 to 5, this sort of falls in the middle of it, where those first and second graders are still in that 6 to 7 year age span that is included in the pre-operational phase. This phase is divided into 2 stages: the preconceptual phase from ages 2 to 4, and the intuitive thought phase from ages 4 to 7. We start seeing shifts in kids from egocentric thought, although it's still very evident, to more social awareness. So, this is the case when kids are watching TV and they see the picture of the starving children in Africa. They go, "But mommy, send my food there." They don't understand that food cannot be sent, or at least not the way they're thinking about their food, cannot be sent to Africa for these children, but they want to help them. And that's part of this social awareness that they have. They may look at a child that is feeling sad and they go over and put their arm around them and comfort them. This is they're starting to put themselves into how someone else feels, and they're able to consider other viewpoints other than just their own when they look at different concepts. Their language is continuing to develop, and so their vocabulary is growing quite large at this point. They're starting to be able to see the cause and effect of things going on around them. Specifically, as 2-year-olds, they were very impulsive. They would just do, if the thought went into their head, they did it. But now the thought goes into their head, and the other thought of, oh, if I do that, mom's going to get mad at me and I'm going to get in trouble. So they start to know that when X, Y, and Z happens, it results in 1, 2, and 3 happening. They start having a concept of time, but it's not completely understood. So they know that there is tomorrow, but they may not completely understand that that means that they're going to go to bed and get up before something is going to happen tomorrow. And they may have to have that explained to them many times because they are so anxious for some activity to happen. They are still using magical thinking, so they still have this idea that if I think something, it's going to happen to someone else. So here's one of our questions. In terms of cognitive development, the 5-year-old child would be expected to do which of the following? Use magical thinking, think abstractly, understand conservation of matter, or comprehend another person's perspective. So even though we just talked about the fact that they're starting to understand somebody else's ideas that are different from their own, they don't have a comprehension of them. So we have to think about how these words are being used. We talked about they're beginning to understand another person's perspective. So that would make that one a wrong answer. We know they're not thinking abstractly. We know they don't understand the conservation of matter. That's a very large concept for them to understand at 3, 4, and 5. So we've basically ruled B and C out right away. And you should probably be sitting there and saying, well, it's either A or D. But since we talked about them just beginning to understand other people, now this one implies that they have full understanding. So the most correct answer on this question would be A, they're using magical thinking. When we look at their moral development, they're still at a very basic level of moral development. It's very much obedience versus punishment oriented. And they're naive in their orientations. Actions are to satisfy your own needs, and they're less concerned about the needs of others. So what we see with this situation is they have a little friend over to their house to eat lunch. And as they're eating lunch, they go over and grab the first sandwich that's made. And they really aren't worried about making sure that their friend gets a sandwich as well. But they're starting to get a sense of justice and fairness. They aren't quite to the stage where they're playing games that require rules, but they may be starting to get a few games with rules as they get into that uh, 4 and 5 year age. And with that, it becomes very much of you're cheating, that's not fair, you always win, things like that. When we look at spiritual development, they usually are starting to have a knowledge of faith and religion that's learned from their significant others and from the religious practices of their families. So, if there's no religious practice within the family, then they're not going to be learning those religious practices. There's a development of conscience that's strongly linked to their spiritual development. However, they may interpret illness as being a punishment from God. And this is especially an issue if their parents also have that view of God. That if you just would have behaved and obeyed, then God wouldn't have punished you by making you sick. They're starting to have a development of their body image. There's an increasing comprehension of what is a desirable appearance. So at this age, we're starting to see kids going, no, I don't want to wear the blue shirt. It's icky. I want to wear the green shirt. Or I want to wear the green shirt because that's like my friend Tommy's shirt. They start becoming aware of racial identity and differences in appearances and biases that may be related to that. So, this is when you start hearing kids ask you questions like, "How come my skin is white and my friend's skin is black?" Um, I was living with a pastor and his family while I was in my nurse practitioner program that they were African American. And one of their boys was at this age. And one day we were down in the basement and I was doing laundry and the kids were playing. And one of the little boys looked at me and he goes, "Faye, why are you white?" And and of course, being in a pastor's family and everything, I talked to him about the fact that that's how God made me, just like that's how God made him with his beautiful brown skin. And and he was like, "Oh, okay," and that was fine. That's all he needed to hear. I went upstairs after my clothes got put into the dryer, and I talked to his mom, and I said, "Oh, by the way, I thought you'd like to know uh, that he had asked me this question," and you could have just seen her just like the shocked look on her face, and she's like, "Oh, Faye, I'm so sorry." And I said, "No, that's okay. That's just normal for kids at this age. They're curious about things like that." So we start seeing that they've been hearing their families talk about people of different races, and they start to pick up some of those biases that may be going on within their families. They also have this very poorly defined body boundaries. And what that means is, for instance, if they get a cut on their finger, they're afraid that all the blood in their body is going to bleed out and until it gets healed up. So they don't really understand about healing. They don't understand that a scab is going to be formed, even though they've had scabs before. They can be frightened by intrusive experiences in healthcare where things, they may have to have examinations um, that they consider to be intrusive. For instance, this is an age where when the doctor is looking in their ear to look at their ear structures and for infections and fluid and stuff like that, they think that when the doctor's looking in their ear, that they're looking inside their brain because they don't realize that there's a difference, that there's that the ear stops and they can't just see from one side to the other side of the brain. Of course, cartoons don't help them any with this particular problem. When we look at the development of sexuality, this is the age when we start seeing the Oedipus. complex where they have a strong attachment to the opposite sex parent, but they identify with their same sex parent. So they want to be, like little boys want to be strong and protective, just like daddy is. Someday they want to be able to shave like daddy does, but they are totally and completely in love with mommy. And little girls are totally and completely daddy's little girl. This is the age where that's especially strong. They start becoming concerned with, excuse me, concerned with modesty. They don't want their body parts exposed to everyone. You'll start seeing them put their hands over their private parts, and they start talking about dressing up like mommy or dressing up like daddy. They're starting to explore their genitalia more, and they're starting to ask questions about sexual reproduction, especially if their mother becomes pregnant or they see somebody close to the family who's pregnant. And it's like, well, how did the baby get inside there? You got to get the baby out of there. So they start wanting to have answers to how babies get inside mommy's tummies. When we look at social development, there's individuation that happens where they really are starting to see the difference between themselves and their parents. And they start understanding that they are an individual that's different from mom and dad and may have different thoughts and different ideas than mom and dad have. They've pretty much overcome stranger anxiety and fear of separation from parents. And in many cases, parents often find this a really difficult time because they'll go right up and start talking to somebody that they don't know. They still, however, even though they have overcome this fear of separation, they still need parental security and guidance. So, what we often see is that if parents are still present in a social activity, that the kids will go off and play somewhere, but periodically the kid comes back just to check that mom and dad or mom or dad are still there to give them security. They still get security from their transitional objects, their familial objects, because those are things that are familiar to them and it gives them comfort. In the hospital, we start seeing play therapy used for working through fears, anxieties, and some of their fantasies that they've developed. Language is their major mode of communication now, and they become very socially interactive. Their vocabulary increases dramatically between ages 2 to 5, and the complexity of their language increases as well. So basically, what used to be want water, need food, want carrots, things like that, now becomes, mommy, I want carrots. They are so yummy. Or that cake you made yesterday tasted really good. I want some more. Things like that, because they are starting to put this cause and effect thing together. When we see personal and social behavior, they need minimal help with toileting, eating, and dressing. Parents love it when kids get to be this age because they can actually tell a kid to go in their room and get dressed, or go to the bathroom before we leave, things like that, and the child's able to do it on their own. Not only that, but this age, they really want to please their parents. They have internalized values and standards of the family and their culture, and they may actually start to challenge some of their parental values. So if mom and dad are telling them that the sky is blue and the child sees the sunset and it's pink, the kid may go, "No, mom, see, it's pink. It's not blue anymore." And so now they're starting to, they can get, they're still very literal at this age, but at the same time, they're starting to understand how the world around them works. And they may question why their parents think one thing versus another. They start having associative play now. So now they're playing with their friends instead of next to their friends. They imitate the activities of life around them. You start seeing a lot of imaginative play with them where we have little kids may be out in the sandbox with cars and trucks, and they start talking about how this truck is going to go build a city over here in the corner of the sandbox, and they have to go over and get dirt to build a mountain. And but we also see these um, their imaginary playmates. So you're sitting next to a kid, or you start to sit down next to a kid, and they go, "No, no, 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 don't sit there. You're gonna sit on Mr. Bubbles." And you're like, "Mr. Bubbles?" And they go, "Yeah, Mr. Bubbles sitting there, and if you sit there, you're gonna squish him." They may want a plate set at the table for Mr. Bubbles. And a lot of parents find this really disturbing when kids start having their imaginary friend come to visit, where other people just kind of go, "Well, whatever," because eventually Mr. Bubbles and any other imaginary playmates that they uh, develop will disappear. And like I said, we start seeing dramatic plays. So they start imagining that their dolls are going on a big trip, and maybe they have cars that the dolls fit into. And so they put them in the cars and they take them all over the place. And it can be very dramatic. They may get hurt in the process, and the ambulance has to come. It's their play is fascinating to listen because it's very detailed in what's going on. Some of the concerns that happen related to normal growth and development is that as they go into preschool and kindergarten, there are developmental screening tools to look at their readiness for school. And the children take these tests before they go to school to make sure that they're going to be successful in a school situation. Uh, it's also important as far as the school nurse is concerned and the family too, that that there is infection control in the school setting. Infection control includes washing your hands after you've gone to the bathroom or after you've been playing out in the dirt, before you eat, things like that. And without that, we'd have kids sick all the time. And then introducing that child to the schools. That's why we have little orientation days for kindergarten for kids that are not currently in preschool at schools that have kindergarten. As far as sex education, this is about the time that kids start asking, where babies come from. How did the baby get inside mommy's tummy? How did I get out of mommy's tummy? So, this is the beginning of being honest with kids and being open and not embarrassed when we're talking to the kids about how life begins. We also have to be careful that we're not over answering a question. They may be simply wanting to know, where do babies come from? Well, the baby grows inside the mommy's tummy. And that's all they need to hear. And they really aren't wanting to know about the sperm and the egg and the sexual act that got the baby inside of the mom's tummy. They just want to know, oh, the baby grows inside the mommy's tummy. Okay, that's it. They start exploring their own genitalia. They have curiosity about what other people's genitalia looks like. And so there's a little bit of playing doctor that begins around these ages. Preschoolers also have a lot of fears. Fears of the dark, of being left alone and nobody there to take care of them. They may be afraid of certain animals like snakes or large dogs. They may tell you that they're afraid of ghosts and or that the boogeyman is living underneath their bed or in their closet. Um, or that they may be afraid of objects or persons that are associated with pain. So if every time they go to the doctor, they never go to the doctor just for a general checkup or when they're not feeling good, they only go to get their immunizations, then they're going to associate the doctor's office with getting shots or immunizations, and they're afraid that every time they go to a doctor's office, they're going to have this painful procedure done to them. And even if they are seeing the doctor when they have ear infections or something like that, where they're not getting a shot, often you'll hear kids get fearful at the idea that they're going to go see their doctor because they know that there's a good chance that they may get shots with that. There's different techniques that can desensitize children so that their fears don't affect them so profoundly. When we look at stress in young children, a minimal amount of stress is actually beneficial because it teaches us how to deal with stressful situations. It teaches us techniques to help reduce the feelings of anxiety that comes along with stress. And so the parents need to be aware of what kinds of signs the children may be showing when they have stress. They may become very anxious, they may become clingy, they may be more emotional around their homes, crying or becoming angry easily. And so we don't want to completely prevent stress, but we want to prevent the type of stress that the children really have no control over and not give children adult levels of stress. Children don't need to know about financial stress or um, job loss stress, things like that. They may understand that that's what's going on in the family, but they don't need to be hearing all of the financial problems that are associated because dad lost his job. Um, they will come up with enough fears on their own when they hear that. Although often, if they hear that dad's lost his job, that just means that daddy can stay home and play with me more. Um, and only in them saying, well, if daddy doesn't get a job, then we won't have money to buy food. Then they start worrying about whether or not they're going to have food to eat. And in general, we don't want kids to deal with that type of stress. It's beyond their cognitive ability to understand how that works, and that there may be ways of dealing with that. We want to schedule adequate rest for children at this age, and we want to prepare them for any upcoming changes to maximize their coping strategies. So, if we know that a child is going to start school in 2 weeks, then we're going to start talking to them about in 2 weeks, you're going to start going to school. And in the morning, this is what we're going to be doing. And start preparing them for that activity of going to school. Aggression is actually a fairly common problem in 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And it's does the definition is that it's behavior that attempts to hurt another person or to destroy property. And most of the time we look at little 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, and they're just the sweetest kids at that age because they do want to do the things that people ask them to do. However, um, they are not beyond just going over, they see somebody do something they don't like, and they're not beyond just going over and biting them for no particular reason other than they just didn't like the way they looked, or they said something that they didn't like that particular moment. And this aggression can be influenced by biologic, sociocultural, and familial values. And some of the factors that increase the risk of aggressive behavior include gender. So, what we tend to see is that little boys tend to be more aggressive than little girls are. Little girls tend to choose passive ways to be aggressive, like ignoring their friends and things like that, where little boys are more likely to just go over and slug somebody for their behavior. It can be related to frustration. Um, I my son was just a real sweet little kid. He had a lot of problems growing up, but in general, he was just a happy, sweet little kid. And when I sent him to first grade, uh, one day I got a phone call from the school because he had kicked somebody in the stomach. And I was like, he did what? And I went to the school, and apparently, what had happened, and again, remember, this age is very tied into what's fair and what's just. And apparently, one of the more aggressive children in the classroom had cut line to get a drink of water after recess. And apparently, the kids had said, "That's not fair, get to the back of the line." And the kid wouldn't do it. And when the kid wouldn't do it, my son got very irate with the idea that this child was doing something that wasn't fair, and he went over and, even though he'd never taken karate kicked him in the stomach. um, it was interesting talking to the principal because the principal said probably the kid deserved it because he's been known to be kind of a bully in the classroom. But my son still had to be punished for his behavior and couldn't go to school the next day. uh, so we see this in kids. They don't necessarily think things all the way through. It's not that they're bad children when it comes to these actions of aggression, but they're responding to their levels of frustration. They may have be modeling behavior that they've seen others, especially adults or people on TV, doing, and or they may have had that kind of aggression reinforced at home by if something like that happened. A parent may have said, "Oh, that's my son," and been all proud of them for having stood up for himself. And so that may be one of the things that are going on with them. It's not uncommon during these early years that they have problems with speech. And sometimes it's just a developmental situation where their mouth and coordination of their tongue just isn't quite at the level that it needs to be. And so they tend to say some of the words, they call it dyslalia. Um, words that have fish. They may drop the F and call it ish, or R's may become W's because W's are easier to say than R. The R sound comes way back on the back of the tongue, and it's just not, they aren't mature enough yet to control that part of their tongue to get that word out. And so we often see articulation problems at this age, and sometimes it can end up with all sorts of words that we would rather that they not say because of that change in articulation. Stammering is not uncommon in this age grade, and stuttering. And obviously, I never outgrew some of those things because I still have a little bit of stuttering and stammering problems. There is a tool known as the Denver Articulation Screening Examination, or DACE, that is a tool for assessing speech problems. However, if kids are having a lot of problems with their speech, referral to a speech pathologist is the most appropriate way of dealing with these speech problems and having them assessed. Because then the speech therapist can give the parents ideas on how to help the child to have better speech and to develop the ability to say these letters of the alphabet that they're having difficulty with. When we look at promoting health, specifically with nutrition, the caloric requirements of preschoolers is approximately 90 calories per kilo per day. And the fluid requirements are approximately 100 milliliters per kilo per day. And that depends on the amount of activity or the climate that the child is playing in. So, if we have a child that is in a hot climate and they are running all over the place and being very active, they obviously are going to have a higher fluid requirement than if it was a winter day and they're playing inside of the house and it's more sedate play that they're participating in. One of the things that happens, especially with 3 and 4 year olds, is they go into food fads. And basically, they will, if you ask them what they want to eat, they'll say the same thing every day. So they may get into a phase where all they want are chicken nuggets. And so if you say, well, what do you want for supper tonight? Chicken nuggets. What do you want for lunch today? Chicken nuggets. And so often there has to be some compromises going on. Well, you can have chicken nuggets if you eat some broccoli with it. Or you can have some chicken nuggets, but you also have to eat your carrots. And so sometimes they'll sit there and whine and cry because you make them eat the vegetables too. But this choosing of one food, it usually doesn't last for a long period of time and often will change from week to week. So it may be chicken nuggets this week, it might be pizza next week, or it might be hot dogs or hamburgers or something like that. And basically, the kid will almost refuse to eat anything else except whatever this fad food is that they've decided is their favorite, that they don't want anything else but that. But a parent that has a strong relationship with the child can usually get some compromises to get a little bit of healthy food mixed in with that. Usually, kids of this age sleep about 12 hours per night. Naps start going away as kids get to be 3 and a half and 4. Usually, moms really regret that age because they've gotten used to having a little bit of time in the afternoons when they don't have to pay quite as close of attention to the kids and they're able to get some of their um, household activities done or have just a moment to themselves without the kids demanding activities. Free play is usually encouraged as far as activity, usually not so much a planned play activity for them, letting them choose what they would like to play with. And the emphasis as far as their activity is uh, things that are fun and things that are safe for them to do. This age group also can have some sleep problems. And encouraging a consistent bedtime routine usually helps to prevent or at least control some of these sleep problems. Uh, when parents come in talking about children's difficulties with sleep, a thorough assessment of these sleep problems, such as do they have a regular bedtime? Do you have a routine that you follow before they go to sleep? Are they do these what happens before these activities? Have they had a rough day? Have they been very busy the day that these sleep um, problems arise? Are some of the questions that we think about when we're assessing them. Nightmares can be really scary for kids because as they wake up through them, they remember their nightmares. So it may take a while for them to go back to sleep after having had a nightmare. Related but not the same is sleep terrors. My youngest had sleep terrors, and it was very different than nightmares. And what would happen is literally she would either be laying in the bed screaming with no um, realization of what was going on around her, really almost to the point of not being able to hear what was being said to her when we would go in to try to wake her up out of the sleep terror. Um, it's scary for the parent because you go from being in a deep sleep to all of a sudden blood curdling screams. It once she would wake up, we'd ask her what had happened, and she wouldn't be able to tell us why she had been screaming and why she felt so anxious and afraid, even as she was waking up out of it. It is just definitely something that is really unique. I noticed with her that they did seem to happen when she'd had an especially busy day. And so trying to control the activity levels of the day usually would help a little bit with the sleep terrors, but often they just came out of nowhere. By this time, the eruption of the deciduous teeth is complete. Deciduous means that these are the teeth that they're going to be losing. So, just like deciduous trees lose their leaves, deciduous teeth means you're going to lose those teeth. It's important once their teeth are in that they get professional care twice yearly cleanings and examinations by a dentist, and any prophylactic treatments like sealants in their molars and fluoride care. The book talks a lot about fluoride supplements. Most city water already has fluoride in it, but if the child lives somewhere where there's not fluoride in the water, they may recommend fluoride supplements, although fluoride supplements have kind of gone down as far as a recommendation is concerned. When we think about injury prevention, this age group is such an exploring age that teaching kids to be careful and what's dangerous, what's not dangerous, but also developing lifelong safety behaviors like wearing bike helmets when they ride their bicycles or their tricycles is really important. When we're talking to families, the child care focus shifts from a protective um, actions to education. As the kids start understanding cause and effect, then you're able to educate them why they don't want to do one activity or why they need to wear bike helmets and things like that. Children may question previous teachings of their parents, especially as they are starting to learn the whys of things, because the parents may have just said, because I said so. And now parents are actually giving them a reason for why things happen. So they may say, well, why can't I do this? And this is definitely the age of the why. Children often start to prefer the companionship of their peers. This age still is very much a family centered um, relationships, but they start wanting to spend times with kids of their own age. And so you'll hear them say, can I go play with their friend down the street? Or can my friend from church come over to my house? Because they're starting to enjoy the play activities with other children that are of their age, since they're not playing next to them, they're playing with them. So we'll move on to the school age child. School age is generally defined as ages 6 to 12, so about first grade to around seventh grade, sixth, seventh grade. Um, it's a period of gradual growth and development, and they progress with their physical and emotional maturity. Biologically, their height is increasing by about 2 inches per year. So we've gone from 2 to 3 down to just 2 inches. So they're not growing quite as fast as they did as toddlers and preschoolers. Their weight is increasing by about 2 to 3 kilograms per year. Let's go back to the fact that there's 2.2 pounds in a kilogram. So that means that their weight is increasing by about 4 to 6 or 7 pounds per year. So a little bit more than what they were increasing as a preschooler. Um, when you look at boys and girls together, there's usually not much difference in their height or weight at this point in time, although that starts to change as they're getting to the end of this period of their life. When we look at their various systems, their bladder capacity is increasing. That means that they can be in one place for a longer period of time. They don't have to go to the bathroom as often. Their heart starts becoming smaller in relationship to the rest of the body. Up until this point, the heart took a large portion of the chest because the chest itself was small. Well, now the heart is starting to not take up so much space in the chest in comparison to the rest of the body. The immune system is becoming more and more effective as this child is being exposed to more uh, illness, and also as they have received more of their immunizations. One of the things that we see, especially in these first and second graders, is that if this child has been home, so mom has been a stay-at-home mom, or they've been in a home daycare where there's not very many children bringing in illnesses, when that child goes to school, they will be sick, it seems like, all the time because they're being exposed to germs that they haven't seen before. Where children that have gone to daycare, they've been sick constantly as toddlers and preschoolers, and now that they're in first grade, because their body has seen more of these viruses, cold viruses and flu viruses, they aren't as sick as the ones that have been at home all the time, or the other ones that seem to get sick more as well are the ones that have older siblings. And so they've been exposed to the germs that happen at school by their older siblings. They've been sick as toddlers. and preschoolers, and they come to school and they don't have as many illnesses as those that don't have older siblings. Their bones continue to increase in calcium deposits, and although they're becoming more physically mature, it doesn't correlate with their emotional and social maturity. I talked to you all about how my son, having been on that um, 95th percentile on the growth curve, how people would look at him and expected more of him because he was taller than other kids of his age. He was built more like an older kid, and so they just thought that he should act like an older kid. But he was a 6-year-old and he acted very much like a 6-year-old, even though his body looked maybe like an 8-year-old at the time. Part of this growth period is prepubescence, and it's defined as the 2 years preceding puberty. It typically occurs during pre-adolescence, and it can vary in ages for girls from ages 9 to 12, and it occurs about 2 years earlier in girls than it does in boys. So it's not uncommon for us to see prepubescence start at age 9 for girls, but it may not start until 11 for boys if they're early bloomers. The average age of puberty is 12 years in girls and 14 years in boys. When we look at psychosocial development, um, during the school years, best friends of the same sex are very important as far as relationships are concerned. If you think back, this was the days of cooties and don't touch me, you have cooties. And really, the kids don't really want to play with members of the opposite sex much. Freud describes this psychosocial period as the latency period for psychosexual development. When we look at Erickson, we're seeing this developing a sense of industry for the psychosocial stages. And with that development of industry, it means that they're eager to develop new skills. They want to learn how to read. They want to learn how to do math. They want to learn all the different skills that are being taught to them at school. And they start to acquire a sense of personal and interpersonal competence. So I feel competent. I can read really well. I know I can read very well. And my friends know that I can read very well. I know that Jimmy over there is really good in math because he's always raises his hand and answers the questions correctly. They start having a growing sense of independence during this time period. Not so much at the age 6 and 7, but as they get more 10, 11, 12, they want to do things on their own and not have as much supervision to what they're doing. Peer approval is a strong motivator. When I think about these things for myself, I skipped third grade. Um, and uh, it's all started because we moved when I was in second grade. And I went from a larger school to a smaller school. And when I got to the smaller school, they said, well, you can try to catch up with this other group, or you can wait for this other reading group to catch up with you. And it's going to be really hard for you to catch up to the other group, but it's going to be a lot easier if you just sit and wait for this other group to catch up with you. In the school that I had gone to, there were 3 reading groups, and there was sort of the really fast group, the slow group, and I was in the middle group. And kids know the difference between, they know what's going on with this. They know that that fast group is the smart kids. And in many cases, they aspire to be with the smart kids. And they know that the slower groups in their reading groups are the kids that are having more difficulty with this, with the reading or whatever the activity is. And so I remember sitting there and thinking, and this is a kid's brain, not the adult brain now, but I can remember thinking, I'm not waiting for the dumb kids to catch up with me. I'm going to catch up with the smart kids. And every day I would go home and read and read and read and read. And then eventually I caught up with the smart kids, which totally shocked the teacher, which is how I ended up skipping the grade. But that peer approval of saying, I want to be like this person is very important. The opposite side, Erickson is always this versus this, is if you don't feel that you have that sense of industry, you have that feeling of inferiority. And so these feelings may derive from themselves or from the social environment that they're in. So if I had chosen to wait for the other group of kids to catch up with me, then in my mind, that would have meant that all of the other kids would have thought that I was dumb. And I might have felt that I was dumb, that I had to wait for them to catch up with me. It can occur if the student is, or the child is incapable or unprepared to assume the responsibilities that are associated with developing that sense of accomplishment. So we talked a while back about how waiting for the brain to be more mature can be an advantage to some students. So if a child is held back until their brain is a little more mature, they're more likely to be capable and prepared to be successful within the school environment, as opposed to if they're put into school too early. All children feel some degree of inferiority as far as skills that they're not able to master as well. So as a kid, in first and second grade, math was really easy for me. I really didn't have a lot of problems with it. But I had to go to summer school in between second and fourth grade. So when I say I skipped, I really didn't skip as much as I did all of the work in a full year's period of time for both second and third grade. But my teacher didn't have us learn a lot of math. She was really into teaching all of the reading and the social studies and all of that kind of stuff, but she wasn't into teaching the math. And so we did a little bit of math, so we were doing some of the addition and subtraction that were larger numbers, but we never got to the multiplication tables that happened in third grade. And so I got into fourth grade, and all of a sudden I was faced with the teacher saying, you all remember how we did multiplication tables and division last year. And I wasn't the only one who skipped. I looked across the room at the other little boy that had skipped the grade with me, and we just looked at each other with fear in our eyes because we had not done that. We didn't know what she was talking about. And, there's other stories that go along with it. But from that point on, as a student, I feared math because I didn't have the foundation for this higher level of math. And so I always felt that I was inferior and that I couldn't do math. Kind of like some of you feel when you're faced with your nursing math. So I overcame that fear and feelings of inferiority. And so, any of you that are feeling that way, you can overcome this as well. When we look at cognitive development and Piaget, we are now in concrete operations. We're using thought processes to experience events and actions. The child can imagine that if these things happen, that it will lead to something else. They can almost see it in their mind. They're starting to develop an understanding of relationships between things and ideas, and they're able to make judgments based on reason. They have conceptual thinking at this point. When we look at their moral development, they have developed a conscience and moral standards. In the child that's ages 6 to 7 years, reward and punishment guide their choices. They know that if they do things well, they will get a reward, whether it's a verbal reward, a hug, or an actual reward like a trophy or a piece of candy or whatever it is that the reward is going to be. But they also know that if they are disobedient or they are doing something bad, that there is a punishment that goes along with that. The older school age child is able to judge and act by its intentions that prompted it. So this 6 and 7 year old, rules are very important to them. And if you break the rules, you deserve to be punished. Everything is black and white. So, for instance, if you tell the story about somebody who was starving to death and they went to a store and stole an apple or a loaf of bread because they were starving to death, the 6 and 7 year old is going to say they stole. They deserve to be arrested and punished. Where the older school age child is going to say, but they were starving. And if they didn't get this food, they were going to die. And so the storekeeper should be kind to them because they didn't have anything. That's the difference between the younger school age child and the older school age child. The older school age child is starting to see these areas of gray that are that we have in society. Rules and judgment become more founded on needs and the desires of others. When we look at spiritual development, the children start thinking in concrete terms, and they expect punishment for their misbehavior. So you start hearing, especially kids that grow up in a more religious background, saying things like, well, if you don't live the way you're supposed to, God is going to send you to hell. So it's important that that things are explained to children. They may view their illness or their injury as a punishment for any real or imagined misdeed. And in some cases, their parents may reinforce that perception of illness and injury, saying, well, you must have done something bad because God is punishing you now for having done it, because that parent may have that same feeling. When we look at social development, their peer group becomes more and more important the older they get. They identify with their peers, and they are a strong influence as they're gaining independence from their parents. Their sex roles are strongly influenced by their peer relationships. You start hearing kids tease each other about you're acting like a girl, or you're a tomboy, and the implication being there that your actions are not appropriate for your sex role. The relationships within the family, the parents are still the primary influence as far as shaping their personality, their behavior, and their value system, but they're starting to become more independent as they become involved in sports teams or organizations outside of the home. But the parents are not ready to abandon their parental control because they still have needs that only their parents can meet. So, if we look at this from a question side, we would see something like, which of the following statements best describe the relationship school age children have with their families? Children desire to spend equal time with family and peers. Children are prepared to reject parental controls. Children need and want restrictions placed on their behavior by the family, or the peer group replaces the family as the primary influence in setting standards of behavior and rules. So when we look at these answers, we know that they aren't prepared to reject the parental controls because the parents still provide needs for them. So we can rule out that one. We can also take D, the peer group replaces the family as a primary influence because the family still has a strong influence as far as setting the standard of behavior and rules for school age children. That leaves us with children desire to spend equal time with family and peers, and children need and want restrictions. They don't want to spend equal time with their family and peers. At this point in time, family is still very important, and although they love spending time with their peers, they don't want equal amounts of time. So that is one to just get rid of. And that leaves us with children need and want restrictions placed on their behavior by the family. That goes back down to the fact that the family is the primary influence setting the standards of behaviors and rules for the school age child. And they may not want the restrictions that are placed by their families, but ultimately they understand why those restrictions are important, maybe not at that age, but as they look back on their growth. When we look at play, their play involves physical skills. So they're playing sports, they're doing gymnastics, they may be dancing. Their play involves intellectual ability. They're starting to play games, uh, card games, board games, things like that that require them to think through a process and fantasy because they are still making up stories about what's going on in their play. When we look at their play involves physical skills. So we start seeing sports, gymnastics, dance. We see intellectual abilities in their play. They may start to play chess or other things that require them to think through and plan their actions in the game, like board games and fantasy in some of their play. They start to form groups and cliques and clubs. You start hearing kids going in the playground and saying, this is our clubhouse, and you're not allowed because you're a boy, and this is only for girls, or you're a kindergartner and only first graders can be in this club. They start seeing the need for rules. Up until this point, rules didn't mean anything to them, but now rules are important, and if you break the rules, you've cheated. Team play, as far as being um, on a basketball team or a baseball team, and choosing teams and knowing that this person is really good at this game, but this one's not so good. You start seeing the ones that aren't so good being the last ones chosen. And the quiet games, like doing puzzles or games that require just that one person being involved. Puzzle type games become more interesting to them and they master their ego. Sex education, we start seeing more sex play. We're not talking about having sex, but people being interested, the children being interested in other people's body parts. It's part of normal curiosity during pre-adolescence. In middle childhood, it's the ideal time for formal sex education. We talked before about the preschooler not giving them too much information, but at this age, we start talking about babies and the fact that someday we're going to die. We talk about the lifespan. And we start getting information about sexual maturity and about the process of reproduction. And this is when the parents need to have good communication with their children and open communication so that the children feel comfortable being able to ask the parents these questions about reproduction. When we look at the nurse's role, specifically in the schools, more likely than anything else in sex education, um, nurses and parents alike need to treat sex as a normal part of growth and development. And so, if you treat it as just part of life instead of this nervousness and discomfort in discussing it, then your comfort in discussing it is going to make it so a child is going to feel more free in coming to you to talk about it. Answering the questions honestly, um, making sure that kids know that there's a difference between sex and sexuality, and looking at values as far as the problem solving skills involved with sex, so that kids understand that the values, what are your values when it comes to sex? Do you feel that sex should wait until after somebody is married? Or is sex something that nobody thinks is any big deal? Society seems to be headed that direction. And so, with those values, how do we um, answer somebody whose values are different than ours related to sex so that we are still comfortable with ourselves? And again, having open communication with parents between the nurse and the parent as far as what's being taught. Some parents do not want their kids being taught about sex, and they will, if when sex is being taught at school, notes are sent home. And if the parent says, I don't want my kid being taught about sex at school, their child is not taught about sex at school. And showing the parents what is going to be taught, talking to them about it, and sending communication home to the parents about what topics are going to be discussed is very important. As far as developing a self-concept, um, we we define self-concept as a conscious awareness of a variety of self-perceptions, like our ability to do things, our values, and how we appear to ourselves and to others. Uh, there's it's important that significant adults shape a child's self-concept. Specifically, parents have a huge responsibility in the child's concept, because if a parent has been telling their child that they're stupid or that they're not very bright, and sometimes the parents do this just teasing, but the child starts to feel that this teasing is reality for them. And so not only the parents become important in developing that self concept, but so do teachers and leaders in youth groups or church groups. Um, when children have positive self concept, it leads them to feelings of self respect and self confidence and happiness. And children that do not have that positive self concept, if they don't have self respect, they're more likely to have problems with drugs or with promiscuity because they're looking for that respect from others and they think that that's how they get it. When we look at developing their body image, generally children like their physical selves when they're young, and the older they get, the less they like their bodies. And you'll hear kids, talk about, well, my hips are big, I have a big nose, or my eyes are too close together, or I don't like my teeth. And so, as young children, they'll tell you what they like about themselves. But the closer they get to being teenagers, when you ask them to describe themselves, they start talking in negatives about themselves. And body image is influenced by significant others. So if the significant other is comfortable in their body and they are able to express that for the child to hear, then the child is going to be more likely to accept themselves as well. But we have to remember that society and the media have a lot of influence on how children uh, think of their bodies. And they may say, well, I don't have this that this famous person has, and I don't have that famous person has, and so my body isn't as good as that person's. As they get older, there's an increasing awareness of the differences that can influence feelings of inferiority, especially as one uh, younger child may start to have sexual development early. They may view that as a bad thing, where maybe some of their peers may be jealous of the fact that their body hasn't started to develop sexually in comparison to their friends. Some of the concerns that are related to normal growth and development, the school experience is very important in this age group. It's second only to the family as a socializing agent and as a form of developing values in a child. And the peer relationships become increasingly important as a child goes through this phase, or the lack thereof becomes more and more important as well. Some of the concerns that are related include teachers and is the teacher mean to me? Is the teacher nice? Is the what is the teacher's effect on that child overall? The parents are becoming less influential in the child's life the older that they get. Latchkey kids aren't as big of a deal as they once were because we're starting to go into this helicopter parent mode where parents are threatening to report parents who, in their opinion, are not paying close enough attention to their child. However, when we look at socioeconomic groups, the lower socioeconomic groups are more likely to have latchkey kids because they can't afford those after school activities or the fees for babysitters. It's important during this time that parents set limits and that there's discipline for violation of those limits that are set. It's interesting because over the weekend there was a report of this one child who called the police on their parent because the parent had taken away their cell phone as a punishment, and this just wasn't right. And so basically, the police officers told her that as long as she was a minor, that her parents had every right to take away her cell phone as punishment for her behavior, and she better just get used to it. We see dishonest behavior coming up at this age. Up until this point, in toddlers and preschoolers, they're extremely honest. Um, there are some times, especially in the preschool age, where they may not be completely truthful because they know that they're going to get in trouble if they're truthful. But in general, they don't tell lies just for the sake of telling lies. Where as kids get into the school age years, they will tell lies in order to be able to do something that their parent may not allow them to do any other way, or that their teacher may not allow them to do if they were to tell them the truth. And so, setting limits on honesty is important at this point as well. Stress and fears, as far as fears go, we don't see as much of the fear of the dark, fear of animals, things like that in this age group. Obviously, the younger age kids are going to have that, although certainly, fear of spiders and stuff like that still continue even into adulthood. Um, Learning how to control stress. School tends to be a stressor for children, where some of the other things that may have caused them stress at an earlier age are less stressful to them. Nutrition wise, the importance of eating a balanced diet needs to be stressed so that they can have adequate growth. And the quality of the diet often is related to what the family chooses to eat. So, if the family is a very, very busy family, they may not be sitting down for dinner. They may be grabbing fast food on their way to another activity. And so the child may not be getting the well balanced diet that we would expect. Also, we have to look at the quality of dietary choices within the school cafeteria, especially as we're looking at children that are dependent on free meal um, vouchers and free breakfast. This may be the only true balanced diet that they're getting, but is the school cafeteria really giving them a balanced diet? I know there's been a lot of discussion in various school districts about should we be feeding, offering hamburgers for the older kids to eat at dinner, and then they'll say, well, it's the only thing that they'll eat, or that pizza is the only thing that they'll eat, and so they offer that at every meal because at least there's bread, cheese, and tomato sauce. And we know that during the Reagan years, ketchup became a vegetable, although there's very little tomato involved in it. So there's always the concern about whether or not the school cafeterias are really giving the kids a balanced diet. And if they are giving them the balanced diet, are the children actually eating it, or are they throwing it away? And then, of course, we're concerned about fast foods because of the high amounts of sodium in them and the high calories. Often, these fast food meals have an entire day's worth of calories in them. And then we wonder why the kids are having problems with obesity. When we look at exercise and activity, often the kids are involved in sports. There is controversy regarding early participation in competitive sports because of the injuries that are related to them, especially contact sports and head injuries. There's also concerns with physical and emotional maturity when dealing with competitive sports environments. However, we see acquisition of physical skills, and in general, kids in the school age years like to be in competitions. When we look at dental health, um, this is when kids start losing those deciduous teeth. And so usually it's the bottom teeth that they lose, the, bo- the, the middle two bottom teeth that they lose first. And although it's not unusual for somebody to lose a top middle tooth first as well, but usually it's the bottom teeth. And with losing those teeth, they get eruption of their permanent teeth. So, good dental hygiene is especially important as these permanent teeth are coming in, and to prevent uh, dental cavities. We start worrying about malocclusion, so we start seeing kids getting braces during this time period. We worry about dental injuries because they may be involved in sports, or they may get into an accident where a permanent tooth is lost. If it is replaced or reattached quickly, then it's more likely to be successful. We definitely, if we have milk available and a tooth is knocked out, a permanent tooth is knocked out, we put the tooth in milk, not in water. And often it is successful. When we look at school health specifically, we look at it more from the school nurse aspect, and we have the responsibility of the parents to make sure that the child has had immunizations and that they have been seeing their physician and are getting medical care, that there is a medical home, uh, that the school is responsible for making sure that these children have had these um, preventative cares done. And often, health departments work with families to provide immunizations and other health screenings. Within the school, we often have screenings like hearing and vision and acanthosis nigrans. And when the child doesn't pass these screenings, provide referrals to the parents for further workup so that the child can be successful in school. Some of the routine services include emergency care, safety and infection control instruction for the students. They also, sometimes the school nurse is also involved in education for health and health habits uh, t- uh, to be established by the children. We worry about injury prevention because, again, at this age, the kids are very, very active. And the most common cause of severe injury and death in school age children is motor vehicle crashes. And it can be motor vehicle accidents as far as being in the car. It can be that they're on their bicycles, or they're pedestrians and they've been hit by a car. Um, Either way, this is something that we see commonly in children. When it happens when they're on their bicycles, it's usually because they aren't paying attention and they've veered out into traffic. Um, Obviously, as far as prevention of bicycle injuries, we want to talk to them about the benefits of wearing bike helmets, and not only just bike helmets, but whatever sports that they're involved in, that they wear the appropriate safety equipment to prevent injury. In talking to families, we're going to help the parents understand that this is a transitioning period for them, that their child is starting to become more independent, and slowly but surely they're going to have to start letting their child participate in more activities outside of the home, and that the parents need to provide support as unobtrusively as possible. This is a time period when kids start saying things to their parents like, "Mom, you embarrassed me. Why did you have to say that in front of my friends?" And so it's important that they not only provide support, but also discipline in a way that doesn't cause um, psychosocial distress with their child and their peers. The child is slowly moving from the narrow family relationships. And when we say narrow family relationships, if you think about it, normally it's mom and dad and siblings and grandparents, aunts and uncles and cousins, which in some families can be a huge family, but in comparison to a broader world outside of the family and the relationships that are available there, it is a much broader group of friends that this child is now developing. And so we'll move on to the adolescent. Uh, the adolescent period is that transition between childhood and adulthood. There's rapid physical, cognitive, social, and emotional maturation, and it's generally defined as beginning with the onset of puberty and ending with the cessation of body growth at approximately age 18 to 20 years. So there's some definitions that go along with it. Prepubescence, we talked before about how it's the 2 years before puberty hits, and this is the period of time that we start seeing physical changes. Puberty is when sexual maturity is achieved, and so this child can now um, reproduce. Post-pubescence is the 1 to 2 years after puberty, where skeletal growth is complete and the reproductive functions have become established. At puberty, the reproduction um, ability is there, but for instance, menses may not be regular at that point. Adolescence itself is defined as the time of growing into psychological, social, and physical maturity. So it deals more with this total period of time. When we look at biological development, we start seeing the development of primary sex characteristics, both the external and internal organs necessary for reproduction. The secondary sex characteristics are a result of the hormonal changes that happen from the maturity of the internal sex organs. And so we start seeing voice changes, hair growth, breast enlargement, fat deposits in the areas of the body associated with those secondary sex characteristics. And it plays no direct role in reproduction. Um, However, it is part of the overall biologic development that's taking place at that time. When we look at the neuroendocrine events of puberty, we look at the role of the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus to produce um, hormones that stimulate the gonads, and the gonads produce and release the gametes. They also secrete the sex appropriate hormones that result in those secondary sexual characteristics. The sex hormones are secreted by the ovaries, the testes, and the adrenal glands, and they're produced in varying amounts by both sexes throughout the lifespan. The adrenal cortex causes small amounts of secretion of these hormones before puberty. It's how we know that we've got a girl versus a boy. And with the maturation of the gonads, we start having production of the biological changes associated with puberty. Estrogen is considered a feminizing hormone. There's low production of estrogen during childhood, and in males, there is a gradual production throughout maturation. In females, the level increases until about 3 years after menarche. And then the estrogen remains at this maximum level throughout the reproductive life and then decreases with menopause. Androgens are the masculinizing hormones, and they're secreted in small and gradually increasing amounts up to about 7 to 9 years of age, then rapid increases in both sexes until the child is about 15 years old. And it's responsible for rapid growth of the young teenager. In males, the testes secrete testosterone, and the levels increase to a maximum level at maturity. When we're looking to determine sexual maturity, we utilize something known as the Tanner stages of sexual maturity. And these are stages of development of the secondary sex characteristics and genital development. They're defined as a guide for estimating sexual maturity. It's and you might say, well, what difference does it make whether you're off 1 or 2 years? Well, if the body is producing an abnormally large amount of sexual hormones at a young age, we call that precocious puberty. And um, and so when we look at the Tanner stage of what we would expect for that child at that age, and then we see a much older appearing child for these secondary sex characteristics or genital development, then we know that there is an abnormality taking place. Or, on the other hand, if a child ought to be at this stage and they still aren't, we call it delayed puberty. And we need to find out why their body is not producing those hormones to provide sexual maturity. When we look at the sexual maturity for females, again, we have terms. The thelarchy is between 8 to 13 years of age. At this point, we start seeing breast buds forming. The adrenarchy also happens during that time period, and we start seeing pubic hair growth. Menarche is about 2 years after the thelarchy happens, and that's when menstruation begins. Um, we consider puberty to be delayed if there has been no thelarchy by the age of 13. So if you think about the fact that the range for menarche is between 9 and 14, it would make sense that if there's been no development of breast buds by the time a girl is 13, she's probably not going to have her first period by the age of 14. And since we know that the menarche, it usually takes place about 2 years after thelarchy. These are pictures from your textbook, and you can see how the Tanner stages are determined: stage 3, 4, and 5. Stage 1 is pre-puberty, and then you see the development of pubic hair in this particular one. When we look at sexual maturation for males, we talk about the different stages, um, and we're talking about the Tanner stages at this point. I think it's interesting that we have all of these terms for females, but your book really only talks about the Tanner stages as far as males are concerned. I'm sure there's terms for them, but the book just doesn't go into them. In stage 1, this usually happens between ages 9.5 to 14 years. There is testicular enlargement, and the child develops sparse pubic hair. In stage 3, there's penile enlargement. The voice begins to change. There's early facial hair. Gynecomastia appears in about a third of males during mid-puberty, meaning that they get an enlargement of their breasts. And in stage 5, there's penile growth. Usually the first ejaculation takes place at this point, and there's axillary groin and facial hair, and the final voice change. So, up until this point, the voice changes are those funky little squeaky sounds that periodically come out when a boy thinks that everything is fine. But with stage 5, we're not seeing that um, adolescent sound to their voice. They have a consistent, mature sound to their voice. And again, your book shows the Tanner stages for males as well. When we look at physical growth for the adolescents, we see a dramatic increase in growth that accompanies the sexual maturation. Adolescents have this huge growth spurt where about 20 to 25% of their total height is achieved during puberty. And it usually occurs within a 24 to 36 month period of time. And I think back to my son, especially because we really notice it in the boys. Uh, as my son finished 8th grade, the top of his head was even with the level of my eyes. And all of a sudden, he started um, his freshman year of high school, and I had to start looking up at him. He was 6 inches taller than I was. So that all happened in about a 6 to 8 month period of time. He went from being even with me to being much taller than I am. And we see these normal sequences of changes in children. Um, when we look at the sex differences in the general growth patterns, they appear to be the result of hormonal effects during the puberty. We see skeletal growth. We see voice changes in the boys. We start seeing a lean body mass because as they're growing, they're losing this baby fat that they've had as a younger child. And we also see the non lean body mass coming up. So the fat deposits in areas that are associated with the secondary sex characteristics. We also see changes in the skin and the glands and the hair. So we start seeing acne and some of these other things that happen because of the hormonal changes that are happening. Physiologically, the size and the strength of the heart, the blood volume, and the systolic blood pressure increase to adult levels. The pulse rate and the basal heat production decreases as they become more adult-like. Adult values are now present for all formed elements of the blood, and the respiratory volume and the vital capacity of the lungs increase as that growth is taking place and the chest area is growing. We also see increased performance capabilities. This is related to the strength of the heart, the increase in the systolic blood pressure, as well as this respiratory volume and vital capacity. The psychosocial development, we see this sense of identity. In early adolescence, it's this group identity versus alienation. Am I part of everybody else? And if I don't feel like I'm part of everyone else, I feel like nobody likes me and I'm alienated from the group. Development of personal identity versus role diffusion happens in the older teenager, where I have my own identity. I don't have to be everything that the group says that I am. We also start seeing a sex role identity and emotionality that's present during the teen years. When we look at cognitive development, PHA puts them in the formal operations period, which means that we have abstract thinking. They're thinking beyond the present. Young children may say, "Yeah, I'm going to grow up and be a doctor when I grow up," but but as a teen, they're actually looking at ways to accomplish that goal. They start mentally manipulating multiple variables. Well, if I do this, then this is going to happen. But if I would do this, I can make this happen sooner. They're more concerned about others' thoughts and needs as well as their own. Their moral development, by the time they're teenagers, they have an internalized set of moral principles. And they may question the existing moral values and relevance to society. So we see a lot of that in teenagers as they say, "I don't know why you treat people this way," or "We as a society need to be changing and not doing this or that or the other thing." They start understanding duty and obligation in relationship to relationships. So because I am part of this group, I have a duty and an obligation to participate or to defend this group. And we see the fact that others have rights that may be different than our rights. They also have strong concepts of justice and that there is payback for things that have been done improperly. As far as spiritual development, some may question the values and beliefs of their family because they're in this stage of questioning and finding out who they are and what part of their family values they're willing to accept as their own. They're capable of understanding abstract concepts and interpreting analogies and symbols that are often common in spiritual development. They may fear that others won't understand their feelings, and there's a tendency for introspection and emotional intensity. We often see that teenagers feel things very deeply. Um, they're happy at a very deep level, and they can become depressed at a very deep level. And the impulsivity that's still there because they're children often lead to some horrific results because of this emotional intensity. When we look at social development, the goal is to define one's identity independently from the parental authority. And there's a lot of ambivalence on both sides during this time. And parents often view this as a time of great conflict because the child is separating from them, but yet the parent still wants them to be a child and be part of the family. Acceptance by peers is so important during this time. The relationships with the parents change from being a protection or dependency and ideally turns to mutual affection and equality. And most parents would not consider their relationship with their teens to be on a level of equality because they feel like they will always be the parent, and so they never can see that child as being equal to them. But in actuality, that begins to happen. I remember when my daughter turned 18 and I started talking to her about the fact that now that she was legally an adult, that she could start to see the real mom, that my personality and who I was different than the parental mom that she knew so well. And I started telling her stories and relating experiences to her that were more similar to things that I would relate to a friend. And she would go, "Mom, I can't believe you said that. It sounds just like me and my friends." And it's like, well, what do you think? That my friends and I are just talking about mom stuff. And so the child starts seeing the parent as a real person instead of just a parent. This process involves a lot of turmoil, a lot. Often there's a lot of fighting and things like that are going on between parents and children, and it's often in this struggle that's going on that it allows the parent to let go because they start actually being relieved that when this child goes off to college or goes off to be on their own, that this conflict that's been going on in the house will be gone. If some of the literature that I've read talks about the fact that if this conflict was not going on, then there would this separation and this new identity and independence never would happen with children. They would continue to be dependent on their parents. When we look at their relationship with peers, the peers assume an increasingly significant role in adolescence, and they will often talk about their best friends. And I look back at my best friend. My best friend is still my best friend. And peers provide a sense of belonging and feelings of strength and power and the ability to do anything. Peers transform a transitional world between this dependence on the family and the autonomy that this child is starting to experience. And they have a role um, with social media and advanced technology. We now have the ability to be friends with thousands of people, and it's important for the children of this generation to understand that we still need that face to face and personal interaction because that's what real friends are. You can have as many friends as you want on social media, but your true friends are the ones that are there for you in real life. With adolescent sexuality, we start seeing dating. We start seeing questioning of sexual orientation. There may be the beginning of sexual experimentation. Obviously, there's a wide range of that, everything from holding hands to kissing and fondling and sex itself. And some of the reasons behind sexual experimentation include just the curiosity. Well, I hear it's really, this is really fun and this is a good thing versus the pleasure that's involved with it. In some cases, it's a case of conquest, of being able to brag that they've had sex or that they've done this or that or the other thing, uh, which in that context, then you start looking at sexual abuse or rape happening when someone is associating sexual experimentation with conquest. Also, there's a certain amount of peer pressure to conform to the sexual mores of their peer group. If some of them have already had sex, then the teenager may feel that they're inadequate if they have not had sex. So there's a lot of things going on about sexuality during this time period. When we look at the development of self concept and body image, we see often feelings of confusion in early adolescence. There's an acute awareness of the appearance and a comparison of their own appearance with others. They start noticing little tiny blemishes and defects, and they magnify them way beyond what their significance is. So they'll have a tiny little blackhead on their cheek, and they will talk like they have a huge tumor that's there when probably the majority of people would never even notice the little blackhead. Um, they mature to a self concept based on their uniqueness and their individuality if they have developed well. And so um, instead of viewing how I am compared to a group, I start saying, well, I like this about me. It makes me unique. I like the fact that I can sing where maybe my friends aren't able to sing, and that makes me unique and special. Some of the responses to puberty depends on their stage of development. So, in early adolescence, there may be a curiosity of what's happening to my body. How does everything work? And then it may turn to concerns of is this normal? Um, all of none of my friends have breasts yet, but I'm getting breasts, so is something wrong with me that I'm developing sooner than all of my friends are? And conversely, somebody who's a late bloomer may be looking at it and going, what's wrong with me that all my friends have breasts and are having periods, but I haven't started to have mine yet? And then there's that concept of the perfect body. And often, this concept of a perfect body can lead to eating disorders or other uh, problems with their self concept. When when we're looking at health promotion, um, we start seeing encouraging adolescents to take responsibility for their own health, um, encouraging them to choose healthy lifestyle choices, to become active, and to eat healthy foods rather than just the fast foods that they may want to eat, um, to make sure that they're getting their immunizations and staying up to date with those, and assessing for various risk factors that may be associated with either their family or their um, health choices that they've made. Sleep and rest is very important for growth and development for adolescents, but this tends to be a time when adolescents start burning the candle at both ends. And many school districts have actually looked at this on the level that these teenagers have after school activities and then they go home and eat, often not at the normal time for eating. Um, and depending on the activities that they're involved in, jobs and things like that, they may not get to their homework until later in the evening and they're staying up late to do their homework. And so as a result, they tend to sleep later in the day. And so many school districts are looking at um, the schedules for schools so that the younger kids that have a tendency to wake up early go to school earlier in the day, often at an hour or more earlier than the high school students. The middle school kids go to school second in their bus runs. And finally, the adolescents are going to school last but not least, so that they have that little extra time to sleep in the mornings and are able to get a adequate amount of rest. Um, Looking at exercise and activity is important, their dental health, um, and personal care as far as vision and hearing, making sure that they're standing up straight. Um, Good posture results in better circulation and better lung expansion. And so you're going to be able to do more things if you have good posture. We start seeing body art happening at this point as far as piercings and tattoos. Often, again, teenagers tend to do things impulsively, so they may. Um, so it's important for family members to start talking to kids about values and decisions being made as far as piercings and tattoos are concerned, because you get a tattoo and yeah, you can get them taken off, but it leaves a scar. And so under, they need to start understanding that these tattoos are a lifelong decision, that they aren't going to disappear tomorrow if you decide you have changed your mind and you don't want the tattoo anymore. And so making good choices, not, choosing not to put your girlfriend's name on your arm, because chances are you're going to have many girlfriends before you end up being finally married to the great love of your life, is going to be important. Also, this is usually a time that kids start going, "Oh, tans are wonderful," and they start laying out in the sun because it looks so cool to have this dark skin, and they aren't thinking about potentials of ultraviolet damage to the skin and what that will do to them long term, but also the potential for skin cancers. And we are starting to see skin cancers in younger people because of their choices of laying out in the sun. Stress reduction is especially important, and learning how to do various stress reduction activities is especially important. Educational um, action or implementation for teenagers. What can I do to not feel so anxious when I go in to take a test? What can I do when it feels like the world is, my girlfriend's broken up with me and I got an F on my test today, and, when mom and dad have grounded me because of my F, and how am I, I can't get to my football team event, and, how can I learn to deal with those without causing the amount of physical and emotional stress that's going on with it. When we look at sexuality education and guidance, we see a lot of influence from the media and peers and TV and movies and magazines telling kids what they should feel about their sexuality, and not as much coming from their families. But this is the most important time for their family to start talking to their their teen about factual information versus what they may be seeing on the internet. And nurses may be making a presentation based on the developmental maturity of that teen, but allowing them to ask questions about sexuality with the understanding that no, these questions are not going to be reported back to their parents, because it's important for them to be able to ask questions. And then role modeling as far as what um, normal sexuality looks like is important as well. When we look at injury prevention, motor vehicle crashes are the single greatest cause of serious and fatal injuries as teens. Teens do not have the experience driving, and so they make poor decisions. They play with the radio, they go riding with their friends, and they're talking and they're so involved with what's going on with their friends that they're not paying attention to the road. Um, Injuries related to other vehicles. This is when we start seeing motorcycle crashes and four-wheeler injuries. We see problems with firearms and other weapons where um, just the care that needs to be taken with these weapons are not being done because the teenager doesn't view them as seriously as they should. We see sports injuries happening, especially as kids are involved in sports teams. Water safety is important because they really have this feeling that they're invincible and nothing can happen to them, that they are never going to get hurt, and the things that happen to other people cannot happen to them. And so they may attempt to swim across a lake when they don't really have the capability to do that. And so we see drownings happening with them. We also have problems with poisonings and tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs that may be related to the peer group that they're living in. I think about all of these kids that were eating Tide Pods over the summer, that uh, these kids will take challenges from their peers, and not wanting to look weak will do things that in other situations they would never do. So when we're talking to families, parents need a lot of support and guidance. This is a really rough time for parents because they're so used to this dependent child that has been their sweet little one, and all of a sudden they've turned into Godzilla, and they're angry all the time at them. They're slamming doors at them, and it's something that the parents just don't understand. They need information regarding developmental changes and how to help that child gain independence in a responsible way. And they need help letting go and promoting independence of their child as well. So, for our last question, adolescents, unless previously immunized, should receive 3 doses of what vaccine? Hepatitis A, measles, mumps, rubella, the human papillomavirus or HPV, diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. So let's look at this and figure out where we're going. Well, the MMR is done as a child. They also get a booster in their school age years. And so we know that they're not going to get 3 doses of that. So that one can go away. The DPT is the same way. They've gotten all of their DPT shots as part of early school age or early childhood. And so we know that that's not correct either. They're not going to be getting 3 doses of that during adolescence. So that leaves us HPV and hepatitis A. The hepatitis A is not a series of 3 shots. And this is one of those questions that it's there to make you kind of go, well, wait a minute. I got 3 shots for my hepatitis B. Well, yeah, you may have if you were not part of that group of children that started your hepatitis B series as an infant. Hepatitis B is given as an infant with 1 dose in the hospital, one at 2 months, and one at 4 months of age. And so you see hepatitis and you just assume that that's what they're thinking about, but that's not what we're thinking about here. And hepatitis A is 1 shot. The one that you get 3 doses of is HPV, and that's the only one that's left after we rule the other 3 out. So that concludes this lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, and we'll see you in class.